What is Linux Mint? As I mentioned in the first video, in short, Linux Mint is an operating system. Windows is an operating system, as is Mac OS. At a high level, an operating system, or OS, is a collection of programs which manage the computer's hardware and allow you to actually make use of the computer. One of the most fundamental types of program an OS has is called the kernel. It is the kernel which actually manages the hardware resources and makes them available to other programs. In the case of Linux Mint, the kernel used is called Linux. Windows has one called NT. What is Linux? This is a very good question. To answer that, we need to go back in time in computer history to the late 1960s. Two computer scientists at AT&T Labs, Ken Thompson and Dennis Ritchie, were working on a computer operating system called Unix. Not to be confused with Unix. The two are completely different things, though as far as I'm aware neither have any balls. That's probably where the similarities end though. These two scientists were also famous for developing the C programming language, which most operating systems and programs for that matter are at least in part, if not mostly, written in this language to this day. Many modern languages are still based around this one. That is how impactful it is. C also has the nice ability to simply be able to run its code on different computers. This is not something every language could do. Often programs would be written for one computer manufacturer or even just one model or line of computers. With C on the other hand, you could choose to write for other systems very easily if you wanted. Changing Unix to be written in C suddenly meant it could be ported, also known as made to run on, other computer systems with relative ease. This meant by the 1970s, Unix was in wide use across the universities and businesses. You could buy the computer you wanted and you could make Unix run on it, at least in theory. Pretty cool, hey? By the 1980s, the computer industry was awash with various forms of licensed versions of Unix. Berkeley University had one, IBM, Sun Microsystems, Apple and even Microsoft had their own version. All were a bit different, with each computer manufacturer trying to be the best Unix available. In short, Unix was the bee's knees and it had taken the computer world by storm. Was it free? No, it wasn't. This brings us to the open source movement. So for now, we'll leave the history of Unix there and switch to the concept of open source software and the Free Software Foundation. Cue stage for a guy called Richard Stallman, who was one of many who was concerned that the software was becoming too restrictive. In many cases, it was forbidden to modify a program you bought. This is what we call closed source software. You cannot view the program code, let alone be allowed to modify it for your own purposes. Richard started the Free Software Foundation. Free does not mean free as in price, rather freedom to do what you wish with the code or the program you have got. This is where the GPL license comes in. When you get software, you usually get a license to use it. With GPL, you could sell it, however you had to permit them to edit and redistribute the code. It should be noted that most GPL licensed software is free in price too. Philosophy has a part in computing too. It's not all about blinking cursors and beeping noises. We have ethics as well, though we won't cover them just yet. Open source software is often developed by communities of developers from around the world. Sometimes companies assign developers to projects which in turn will benefit them. Other times it can just be one guy in his bedroom. Either way, most of the developers are not paid and they do it for the love. In the 1980s, Richard wanted to create an operating system which was like Unix. There was almost enough software available to make a full OS, except for the kernel, which is critical. He started work on one called Herd, however it didn't attract much development interest. In the 1990s, Linus Torvalds was at a university doing a Unix course. Following some similar license restrictions with the software he was using as part of his course, he ended up developing the Linux kernel. The Free Software Foundation was able to persuade Linus to release Linux under the GPL license, and now they had a kernel and a full operating system. Fun fact, the mascot or logo for Linux is a penguin, because a penguin once bit Linus on the hand. To be clear, he decided this, it isn't meant as a mean joke. Since then, there have been many operating systems which use the Linux kernel, packaged with different sets of other programs for different use cases. We call these Linux distros, short for Linux distributions. When someone says they're running Linux, what they mean is they're running a Linux-based operating system, aka a Linux distro. Two examples you might have heard of are Android and Chrome OS from Google. These are highly specialized, customized and commercialized distros, however, technically they are Linux. Linux-based operating systems are the most popular in the world. However, you don't often see it at home, aside from the Google devices. The vast majority of internet servers and often things you might not think of, like an internet router, smart TV, or even DVD player, is likely running some form of Linux. It is the industry standard for robustness, security, and customizability. Under the bonnet, Linux distros have much more in common with macOS, as it shares a more common ancestor, which is Unix. So, who owns and looks after it all? Linux is owned and maintained by the Linux Foundation, a not-for-profit run by its founder Linus Torvalds. People and companies from around the world, including Microsoft, contribute new code to it. Yes, Microsoft use Linux. A lot. At least internally. They know it's better. Linux Mint is actually based on another very successful distribution called Ubuntu, owned by the company Canonical Limited, which is in turn based on another distro called Debian. While this might sound complicated, it's actually very good news. In essence, Linux is based on two of the most well-supported and enterprise-trusted Linux distros. This means it's very reliable, and the chances are, if something works on Debian or Ubuntu, it'll work on Linux Mint too. Some other distributions are not as mature or much more experimental, ideal for whiz kids. Not what we're after. We want reliability and easy to use. Linux Mint fits this requirement well. Linux Mint is community maintained by many software developers around the world and headed up in France by Clement Lefebvre. I'm sorry if I butchered your name there. We'll just go with Clem. Love the operating system, by the way. And he's the guy who founded it. Unlike some Linux distributions, and ever more so Windows and Mac these days, they work on the principle of it's your computer and you should ultimately be in control of it and the data you store there. Richard Stallman is a big advocate of this concept. If being able to tweak the settings to your heart's content and not being served ads in the operating system and have full control over what you do with your data, then Linux Mint might just be what you need. I told you we have ethics and sometimes lack of them in computing. In short, all you need to remember is Linux Mint is a free operating system developed by the community of developers and is based on enterprise-grade Linux distributions, meaning it is secure, stable, well supported, and most importantly, easy to use. If you'd like to find out more about the history of Linux Mint specifically, we have a very nice history page which I'll link in the description. There are a few varieties or flavours of Linux Mint. Cinnamon, Mate are the main ones. However, there's also XFCE for older computers, LMDE for those who want a more Debian-based version, and Cinnamon Edge, which supports newer hardware. We'll be using Linux Mint Cinnamon as it's nice and easy to use, and many of the buttons are in a similar place to Windows. I'd recommend the Edge version as it's newer and it works better on more recent hardware. There aren't any visual differences other than the version number. Now the theory is out of the way, I'll see you in the next video, Getting Linux Mint. Thanks for watching.